Well, let's speak to the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Have you had those reassurances?
Not yet. I've written to the Chancellor last night. I've been seeking a meeting since Saturday night. We haven't had that confirmation, and I see this morning that another Cabinet Minister appears to have walked back on the Prime Minister's commitment that furlough will be available to Scottish businesses.
This is Robert Jenrick, the Communities Secretary, who's been on TV this morning. He was asked about this. Will Scotland still get the furlough scheme if there's a lockdown in Scotland after the 2nd of December? He said that's a decision the Chancellor will have to make at the time. That's not unexpected, is it? Because it's the Chancellor's decision ultimately.
But the problem is this has been a theatrical shambles from the beginning. They could have given us an answer on Saturday night when Scottish businesses were worried about what it would mean for them. They've dragged it out for 3 days with so many twists and turns, appeared to give answers and then appeared to walk back on them. And this is not a game. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Jobs depend on this. We are needing simple reassurance that Scottish businesses will be treated with the same degree of respect and valued by the Chancellor if and when we are faced with a similar national lockdown or any part of Scotland goes into Tier 4. Now, we have seen throughout the month of October the Chancellor dithering with an extension to furlough. We asked multiple times, indeed so did Wales, Northern Ireland and other parts of England. And a mini extension to furlough was finally granted at the 11th hour when businesses needed it in England.
Well, it was granted on Saturday night. Explain to us why businesses were worried in Scotland on Saturday night, given that it was granted for another month. What were they worried about?
Well, there's 2 key points. One is that we were moving into the protection levels, the strategic framework, on Monday morning. And we'd given that clarity. Businesses knew what to expect. And there was fear that if the furlough scheme is only available for the month of November and there isn't the same high level of financial support beyond November, would the Scottish Government, and this is what the First Minister set out yesterday, would there be an element of pressure on us to move faster into more national restrictions or tougher restrictions in order to try and mitigate the economic harms with furlough support?
So the fear on the part of government was what the Scottish Government might do, not the extension to the furlough, which was announced on Saturday night.
The extension to furlough was in line with the English lockdown. Now, obviously, Wales has gone at a slightly different pace. They're halfway through a national lockdown. They asked for an extension to furlough, which was denied. We are just about to go into protection levels. We had asked for support on furlough to try and mitigate the economic harms. And if furlough is available just for the month of November, the question that the First Minister posed yesterday is that if we're trying to mitigate the economic harms this month, and this month alone, would there be pressure then to go into tougher measures now? And that's why the extension is so key, because we believe that we should be following the science.
Well, indeed. So why would there be pressure then if you're following the science? Why would you suddenly make this political and about the fiscal measures rather than the science?
Because you can't get away from the fiscal measures and from the economic harms. We've talked since the very beginning that there are 4 harms here. Yes, we know that there are the COVID harms. We're trying to suppress the virus. But we can see clearly the other harms, and foremost amongst them is the economic harms. The economic harms, the devastation, businesses required to close. And we do not have the fiscal levers, we do not have the fiscal powers to extend furlough on our own.
But is the science saying to you at this stage, that we need a further lockdown in Scotland?
Well, the future is quite uncertain, so we can't...
No, I'm asking you about at this stage, because the First Minister said yesterday quite clearly that she was wrestling with a dilemma about whether to bring forward a lockdown to gain these fiscal measures. Is the science saying we need a lockdown at this stage?
Well, I think it's saying that the measures that were put in place during October have had an impact, but the virus is still with us. And we've seen the areas that are in level 3 where the prevalence of the virus is high, that we need to ensure that the measures that we've put in place during October and then as part of the protection levels have an impact. But the key point in this is that we look at the health data, yes, but we also look at the economic harms that are being done. And we know that small grants, which is what we've been able to provide as part of the lockdown measures during this protection level strategic framework, they are not sufficient to make a huge difference to businesses struggling to be viable.
So you would sanction a lockdown even if the
furlough.
science, you might sanction a lockdown even if the science says that it may not be necessary?
Well, I think that's a very simplistic question because you can't get away from...
But that's the dilemma the First Minister said she was wrestling with yesterday, isn't it?
Indeed, and that's what we are wrestling with. But you've got to look at, on one hand, the indicators, the health indicators that we've set out, cases per 100,000. We've got to look at the positive tests. But on top of that, you've got to look at the four harms. And I think most listeners would understand that when it comes to putting local authority areas into lockdown measures, we want to ensure that we maximise the economic support to businesses that have already made enormous sacrifices, that are struggling enormously, that have already made redundancy decisions because the Chancellor dithered over extending furlough, and are now looking for as much financial support as possible.
You mentioned Wales. You mentioned Wales, and Wales, as you say, did go into what they called a firebreak lockdown, in essence closing the country down. Northern Ireland did something similar. Did your government make a mistake in not going further with the measures that were introduced a few weeks ago to take advantage of the fiscal help that was available at that time?
Well, we have got to weigh up, as I've said throughout this interview, we've got to weigh up what we're seeing on the health side and on the economic side. And if you recall, back during September, when the first measures around household visiting was put in place, and then into October, break restrictions, the First Minister was clear at that point that we were asking the UK government for additional financial support. Now, I don't want to...
But the furlough scheme was still there at that point. You could have taken advantage of that, couldn't you, and gone further like Wales and Northern Ireland?
On a much reduced level. It was there on a much reduced level. And if you have heard what the First Minister of Wales has said, he's pretty devastated, having pleaded with the Treasury for an extension to furlough because their break restrictions fall on either side of the end of furlough. Now, the point that we've seen in the last few weekdays is that having had a mini extension to furlough when English businesses needed it, why was that not granted when Welsh businesses needed it, or Scottish businesses needed it, or indeed North England businesses needed it? And that's the point that we're still debating today, which is that if Scottish businesses, or indeed Welsh or Northern Irish businesses, need access to furlough because of increased restrictions in any of these areas beyond December, because the public health data suggests that we need to suppress the virus further, then will that same access to 80% furlough be available? And it's important that the detail is there, the same eligibility criteria, the full furlough at 80%, and also an extension to the self-employed income support.
But given that businesses have just reopened yesterday, having been closed in many parts of the country for quite a long time, do you not have a duty to stick with the system that we have at the moment, these new levels that took quite a lot of working out, took quite a lot of understanding on the part of the public to comply with? Don't you have a duty to stick with that for some time to see whether it actually works or not?
Absolutely, and we are committed to making the protection levels work. This is only day 2. The next review, because we're reviewing it on a weekly basis, will be next week. So we will be analysing the data that's coming through and making decisions on that basis.
So that dilemma yesterday that the First Minister talked about isn't really much of a dilemma at this stage because you're sticking with the levels.
It's a huge dilemma.
But you're sticking with the levels you've just said.
We are sticking with the levels, but as I said earlier, we know that the future is uncertain. We know that we can't rule out a move to level 4 for all or part of the country at some point. And if the furlough scheme, as the Prime Minister appeared to say it would be, can be extended beyond December for Scottish businesses, then that makes it a lot easier to make that decision. What we've seen, though, is a lack of clarity and confirmation of the detail. Any business in this country, you ask any business in this country and they will tell you that 80% furlough makes all the difference to their future. We are grappling with an economic crisis, with the likelihood of unemployment rising, GDP falling. We need to do everything within our power to protect the economy and protect our communities.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. That's the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes.